The question arises, what is conservatism? And I like to discuss the ideas, at least, behind conservatism by going to particular individuals as representatives of the position. And I think there are two great figures in the history of conservatism stretching right to the present time. They were contemporaries, they were associates, and they were influential. Those two men were Edmund Burke and Adam Smith. Burke, as I've already mentioned before, was a defender of the rights of Englishmen. He believed in constitutional rights, though of course not in the sense of a written constitution because Britain didn't have one, but in terms of traditional law and liberties associated with the common law. Burke was a defender. And he believed that it was an error to use centralized political power to remove those rights and English liberties, which had been characteristic of the country, he believed, for hundreds of years. So he was a conservative in the sense of defending traditional law, traditional social institutions such as the family and the church. He was an opponent of centralized state power, which he distrusted totally. And as such, he would have said that the centralization of power in the context of the British Constitution was a revolt against tradition and some kind of either revolutionary or rationalist attempt to take away the traditional liberties of individual citizens. The other great figure was Adam Smith. And in 1776, his great work was published, An Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. We know it as The Wealth of Nations. Smith did not believe that the central government could act as a central planning agency for the economy as a whole. He believed in free trade, that is, the right of individuals one-on-one to make exchanges with each other. And he extended that principle to the borders of the nation. He did not think that you should make decisions as a nation to interfere with trade in order to build up the supply of gold in the government's treasury. He believed in what he called a system of natural liberty, and he believed that if individuals were left alone to truck and barter, in the famous phrase, to trade with one another, to seek their own individual self-interest by their own productivity, without coercion and without an appeal to government, that would lead to an expansion of the wealth of nations. In other words, he defended the whole idea of the wealth of a nation in terms of the pursuit of wealth and the pursuit of individual self-interest in a free market social order. He believed in individual liberty, and he did not believe in centralized political power, and certainly not the system that we know of as the old British Empire, the granting of monopolies, the granting of certain kinds of trade routes on the sea. He was an opponent of what we call the British Empire in the sense of the old empire of trade. Well, at that time, so were the American colonists. They were opponents of it too. They didn't approve of the centralization. So Thomas Jefferson reads The Wealth of Nations almost as soon as it's published and adopts the basic ideas of that book. He, that is to say, Smith and Burke, were friends. They respected each other, they corresponded with each other. Now, Burke was no economist. Of course, there was no one called an economist in those days. There were moral philosophers. And economics in the hands of Adam Smith became an extension of moral philosophy. And Burke was not a systematizer in the same way that Smith was. Smith was building this great overarching system of logic, defending the concept of free trade. Well, that was not how Burke thought, but he liked the conclusions. He thought that the conclusions were consistent with his view of English liberty and his view of the danger of centralized political power. So Burke and Smith got along very well. They had great respect for each other. Building a rationalistic system, 800-page system, to defend the idea that a nation gets rich by the freedom of individual citizens, with this other individual who was British certainly by citizenship, who had been born in Ireland, who was a member of Parliament, and who had been a defender of the American cause up at least to the point of the Revolution. Now, Smith was no revolutionary, and Burke was no revolutionary, but he did believe in the rights of individual English citizens. So here they were together in the period of the Revolution and the period after, committed to a system of personal liberty. Smith on the basis of rational thought, the extension of thought, rational thought to the general society. Burke on the basis of traditional English liberties, both coming to the same idea of personal freedom and a decentralized social order.